We have a mix of folks, both from Maryland and from out of state, some folks with farm leases and some folks who need to build them. So that is really helpful for me to know as we get started here. We're a fairly small group, and I'm a pretty informal speaker. So if you have questions, don't hesitate. You can take yourself off mute and stop me. I'm fine with that. Or you can put them in the chat like Jim said, and I bet there'll be some time at the end that we can address them. So let me go ahead and share my screen. I'm going to share my slides with you all. So okay, so what I want to do today is just have a little conversation about farm leasing and do it in a way that I both give you some helpful information about farm leasing and also introduce you to a new free farm lease builder website that we created that I think will be a really useful resource for everybody. So kind of have two missions today. Like Jim said, I work for the Agriculture Law Education Initiative. We're a group of attorneys. We work for 3 different parts of the University of Maryland, and we cover the entire state. Our job is to provide legal education and outreach to farmers throughout the state. If you've never checked out our website, I would encourage you to do so. I've given you the link here. It's just umaglaw.org. We have got a ton of resources on there. Some of them have to do with leasing. A lot of them have to do with a whole host of legal issues that farmers face. We've got labor law resources about seed saving, kind of you name it. And we also have videos and some of our attorneys contribute to the Maryland Risk Management Education blog. So a lot of things you can find on our website there. And if you've got some legal issues and you don't see any resources that touch on those issues, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. That's how we came up with a lot of the resources that we have, is that we heard from farmers who were having problems. So, we're here for you all. Okay, so I am a lawyer. I was in private practice for 9 years before I started working in academia, but I am not here today to provide legal advice. I'm just here today to provide legal education. I will explain the significance and the importance of seeking legal advice during the farm leasing process as we go here. Okay, so a lot of the leasing work that I have done specifically focuses on conservation practices and how conservation practices can be referenced in a lease. So that's a lot of what I'm going to be talking about today. Does anybody know approximately how much farmland in Maryland is leased? Anybody want to come off mute and try to make a guess? It's the same percentage as it is nationally. So if you know the national percentage, we are in the same ballpark here in Maryland.
Is it 30%? Or 60? I don't know.
You're close. It's 40. You're close. It's about 40%. So Maryland and the entire United States, we are at about 40%. And why is that important? Well, it's important because conservation practices are less prevalent on leased farm acres. It's an important point when we're talking about, almost 40% of our American farmland being leased. We, at the Agriculture Law Education Initiative, we really felt it was important to kind of drill down and figure out why these conservation practices were less likely to be on leased acres. We were hearing from farmers that they have these practices on their home farm, but it doesn't work for them to put it on the leased acres. And so for the last probably 3 to 5 years, we've been trying to really figure out how to support farmers with being able to do just that. Some of the reasons why conservation practices are less prevalent on leased acres, these probably won't surprise anybody here, but communication. So, this is going to vary depending on the leasing relationship, but if there's not a lot of communication going on between the landowner and the farmer, it can be really difficult to have conservation practices on the ground. It usually is going to take some communication between the landowner and the farmer in order to successfully make that happen. Another one of the big areas is leasing uncertainty. So, if you're leasing on a handshake, or if you're leasing even on a year-to-year lease, the farmer just doesn't have a lot of certainty that they're going to be on that farm the following year. So, leasing uncertainty is a reason that a lot of farmers gave us when we asked, why is this the case? And they just said, I just don't know. I can't make the investment. I can't make the time or financial investment in ground that I don't know if I'm going to be on next year. And then a knowledge deficit, on the part of the landowners. If we have landowners that are new to agriculture, maybe they inherited a farm or bought a farm. I know during COVID, a lot of folks, bought farms that weren't necessarily involved with agriculture prior to the pandemic. So knowledge deficit can be a big problem. Landowners might not necessarily even know how to engage the farmer with a conversation about conservation practices. And so a lot of the success we have seen with getting conservation practices on farmland, it's not all, but a lot of it has been farmer-led. So, farmers have been willing to share some of their knowledge and educate the landowners about the practices that are appropriate and about the whole process. Okay, so why are leases such an important part of the process of getting conservation on rented ground? Leases, putting the conservation issue to the side, leases are really important just to preserve that leasing relationship, right? And so, the problem with farming on a handshake or farming on an old or out-of-date lease is that it just doesn't reflect what's actually going on there, right? So we all know that memories fade, and when memories fade about what exactly the handshake deal was, that's when we end up with legal conflict, and legal conflicts can unfortunately result in, landowner and farmer dissolving that relationship and problems. So a simple lease can help preserve that relationship, and that's one of the big goals of our work. Reducing misunderstandings and legal conflict, like I just said, I will never advocate for a complicated lease. Leases don't have to be complicated. Judges don't want them to be complicated. Lawyers, good lawyers don't need them to be complicated either. You don't need to have legalese or Latin or words that people don't understand in a lease. They need to be simple, and really what they need to do is just clearly set expectations. So what's the landowner expect the farmer's going to be doing, and then vice versa? What does the farmer expect, they're going to be able to do on the land? Putting that handshake down in writing is really important. They are a good business practice. Farmers are very exposed when they're farming on a handshake or without a good solid lease, right? You've put a lot of money into the ground, and we all know that, farmers can't turn on a dime and just, leave at a moment's notice. They've got a lot of investment there. A good lease protects both parties. A one-sided lease, sometimes when folks have leasing problems and they show me what they're using, I say, ooh, well, this is fair for one party, but not for the other. And a lease shouldn't be one-sided. It should be equitable and protect both parties. Here in Maryland and nationally, there isn't a lot of black letter law or statutory law that has to do with farm leasing. What that means is that, folks who have a handshake or are working on an older lease that doesn't really reflect what's going on, they shouldn't expect to be able to go into court and have some law that's going to be able to protect them. It's really not there. This is an area of the law where we expect landowners and farmers to hash these things out themselves and put that agreement down in writing. The law is just not going to back you up. Especially if you end up in front of a judge who doesn't have a lot of background or information about agriculture, which can happen. Often required for federal cost share programs. So when we're talking about conservation practices, thankfully, there's a lot of funding out there that's available. Now more than ever, especially with the new USDA funds for climate smart agriculture, there's a lot of money out there, but you need a lease to have most of those programs on leased ground. And so if you go into your local USDA, NRCS office, Natural Resource Conservation Service office, and start asking about those programs, if you tell them it's on leased ground, they're going to say, we want you to check a box that you have a lease. And in some cases, they're going to ask you to show them the lease. So it's good practice to get that lease set right from the beginning. All this boils down to is certainty, right? We want to give the farmer certainty so that they will invest in the ground. And that's really, you know, the key. If you take anything away from this, if you're a landowner or you're a farmer, you know, just think about the value of the certainty. It's going to give the landowner peace of mind that the farmer is doing all they can. And it's going to hopefully improve the quality of the land, right? The farmer's going to treat it better if they're going to be certain that they're going to be there in the future. They're going to invest their time and money. So having that certainty benefits both parties, mutually beneficial. Okay, so to give you a little bit of details on a project, because there's some resources here that I think might be helpful for you all. We engaged a project on this topic. We got a USDA grant, and we developed this agricultural conservation leasing guide. So this guide walks you through the various conservation practices, and it gives you some boilerplate language and considerations, things to think about and work through both on the landowner side and the farmer side when you're talking about these various practices. So I recommend checking this resource out. It's on the ALEI website. We rolled this out in Maryland by training the ag service providers, because those are really the trusted folks and the folks that, in our experience, both landowners and farmers felt comfortable going to with their leasing concerns. So we trained service providers, and then the service providers went on and trained farmers and landowners. We got a lot of interest from landowners in this project, more than we anticipated, which was interesting, and hopefully, you know, emblematic of, you know, kind of a public understanding that the conservation on farms is important and something that landowners should educate themselves about. And then we ended up with a good number of farmers who made efforts to use conservation practices on leased ground. So this guide is also available from this link, and we have a bunch of other resources available there too. There's a great resource on tax consequences there, and some recorded webinars and other things that we did on this topic. So check those out. All right, so easy for me to sit here and say that a lease is going to help conservation. Let's break it down. How is it going to actually support conservation? The first thing, you know, when you're forming a lease, you're going to have to start with communication. So communication's the beginning of the process. You've got to think about what your goals are for the property, the landowner's goals and the farmer's goals, and then reach a consensus about your priorities. Considering the rent type and the lease term. So I know someone in the chat typed that they have a flex cash rent. That's a type of rent that's going to spread some of the risk across the landowner and the tenant. A lot of folks just go for the fixed cash rent lease. And in some instances, that makes sense. In other instances, if it's landowner driven, for example, if the landowner is insistent that some conservation practices be put into place and the farmer is afraid of risk, on yields or profit, a different rent type is a way to share in that risk, and it might be a more equitable thing to do. Lease term, we'll talk about that and how important that is. It's crucial in this process. Defining farm standards, that's really just about what is good farming. What do these two people expect? What does the landowner expect the farmer's going to do, and vice versa? It's a good idea to have this spelled out in the lease, and this is because so many states don't have it defined in the law. So in a lot of states, you don't have a clear definition of what good husbandry is. Good husbandry is just our way of saying what good farming practices are. So you need to make this clear, especially, a landowner, if they're expecting certain practices, whether that's reduced tillage, or use of cover crops, what have you. If that's not in the lease and the farmer decides not to do that, it's going to be very difficult to use that as a reason to break that lease early. Restrictions and easements. So we'll talk about how conservation easements should be addressed in the lease, or any other restrictions that the farmer should be aware of. If there's certain things the farmer should or should not be doing, put it in the lease. Addressing specific practices. This is really about those specific conservation practices, making it clear who's responsible for what. And then, like I said, sometimes we have some risk of yield loss or profit loss. There's could be some upfront installation costs involved with some of these practices, or maintenance costs. So if the farmer's expected to take those on, a good way to maintain that relationship is to think about those costs when you're drafting the lease, and think, should those be taken into consideration? If a farmer's taking on a lot of maintenance responsibilities for something, should they be compensated for that, and how? Landowners are often confused about what rights they have to go back onto the farm. And, in short, it's usually not very much. They don't have very much leeway to go back onto the farm. If the landowner wants the right to go back onto the farm, whether that's to take soil samples or hunt or show it to potential buyers, what have you, those rights of entry should also be defined in the lease, so that it's clear to both parties under what circumstances the landowner is going to be back on the farm during the term of the lease. Number one rule of leasing: leases are live documents. They should not be gathering dust on a shelf year after year after year. It's something that you should pull out at least annually and review it and revise it. It's easy to review and revise a lease. In some cases, parties can do it simply by crossing through provisions and both initialing. You don't always have to do, back into the lawyer's office and spend a lot of money, depending on what you're trying to do. But in any case, it's good to keep it relevant. It's good to have it be an actual reflection of what's going on there. I've asked farmers, so many times over the years, can I see your lease? Would you mind showing it to me? And they pull out something from the 90s and they say, well, it ain't broke, right? Everything's still okay. It may be for a while, but operating under a lease that's out of date it's not really going to be useful for anybody. If things go south, if there's conflict or misunderstanding, that lease probably isn't going to be helpful. Okay, so I've told you a bunch of things that I think are really important for you to consider and to do. And the good news is we're here to help you do it. So here is the leasing website that we have created. Like I said, it's free. It is not Maryland specific. It is meant to accommodate folks throughout the Chesapeake Bay region. So that's covers a whole lot of states here on the East Coast. But what we wanted you to do is just to be able to simply build a draft that would help you with this conversation. So by using this tool, you're going to, have some assistance with supporting on-farm conservation in a lease. We also have a bunch of information here, and this is really to overcome that knowledge deficit issue that I talked about. So, I'm sure we've got folks on the webinar today with a mix of experience and knowledge about agriculture in general and about conservation. So we put a lot of basic information on here because, thinking, hey, if somebody just bought a farm during COVID and they really don't know much, they should be able to look at this and figure out who are these different people here, right? Whether it's extension, natural resource conservation service, soil conservation districts, non-governmental organizations, what role do these folks play in this process of putting conservation on leased ground? And then we've given you some leasing and communication strategies for both parties to consider. And then as you go through this lease builder, you'll be able to have the draft populate with specific language. And I'll show you that here in a minute as we go through. So I'm just going to talk through the different steps of the process. And as I do here, you'll see this picture here with the communication and all this verbiage underneath. That is all directly from the website. So if you go under communication on agleasebuilder.org, you'll get this information. But, communication starting at the very basic level, just, what we can get through here on a lunchtime webinar. To the landowner, what are your plans for the farm? That's a sort of a good suggested question for farmers to open up this conversation with the landowner. It's going to matter. It should matter to the farmer. If the landowner's planning on selling the farm in a year or two, that's going to impact the farmer's investment, right? Or it has the potential to. If the landowner's planning on keeping the farm and the family, if there's no threat of that, then, that's a different conversation in terms of the types of practices that are going to be appropriate. And then if it's a landowner wondering how to broach this conversation with the farmer, simply, are there characteristics of the farm that could be improved? Right? So we work with a lot of landowners who seem intimidated to initiate this conversation if they're not familiar or very knowledgeable about agriculture, because they want to be deferential to the farmer, and they frankly feel, that they just don't have the expertise to kind of question what the farmer's doing. But I wouldn't think about it like that. I don't think you run the risk of offending the farmer if you come at this in a way where you are simply trying to, share in what they know, right? You are being deferential, deferring to their experience. They're out there every day. They see what's going on the farm. They probably have identified issues. Do we have drainage issues? Do we have erosion issues? What do you think could be improved here on the farm? And then farmers will hopefully will open up a little bit more if you start it from that place. So here's some more suggestions for kickstarting communication, how conservation practices could benefit the land. A good strategy that a lot of the folks that we were involved in our education program, a step that they felt very comfortable taking was incorporating a soil and water conservation plan from their local soil conservation district in the conversation. So if there was an existing plan, referencing compliance with that plan in a lease as a way to define good stewardship. If there's not a plan, having a plan created and having the landowner and the farmer work through that process together is also a great way to kickstart this process. You end up with a third-party expert from the soil conservation district. The plan's going to give you suggestions and things that you can talk through. So it's a great tool for communication and for setting conservation standards. And then it opens up the conversation of how can we make this implementation and maintenance of the practice equitable. We did hear from farmers that they said, oh gosh, we're concerned that you're going to rile a bunch of landowners up, and it's just going to mean a lot of extra time and money on our end, right? Like, please don't rile the landowners up about putting a bunch of stuff on the ground. It's just going to take land out of production and just going to mean more work for me at the end of the day. And we hear that, and that's why we have these suggestions to try to help you, the leasing parties, make it more equitable. So for the rent provisions, when you work through the lease builder, you're going to be asked questions about what type of rent you want, and it's going to explain the different types of rent and hopefully give you some information on whether those types would be appropriate for you. We don't want any data from anyone about specific rent numbers. I know people are very sensitive about keeping that information private, how much they're charging for rent. So this is going to populate with some suggested language with fill in the blanks so that the parties can then go through and put that in on their end, and we won't retain any of that information. So let's move on to length of the lease. So the length of the lease is crucial to whether or not conservation is going to work. Conservation practices often take time to yield results. These things usually don't create benefits overnight. Sometimes a year-to-year lease is just not going to give the farmer the assurance that they need. And so when you're playing around in the lease builder and you're asked the questions about the lease term, hopefully we've put some information here to try to educate the farmer. You see here it says a longer lease term gives the farmer more security. We're putting that in there for landowners to hopefully encourage them to offer, longer term leases. Another thing to think about, aside from the benefit to the farmer personally, is also the lifespan of the practice. So if you deal with the Natural Resource Conservation Service, they're going to tell you, if we're putting in a grassed waterway, which is, meant to slow down soil erosion as it's running off of the field and help your drainage issues. what is the lifespan of that practice going to be? And consider whether or not you'd want a lease to match that lifespan of the practice. An alternative to a longer lease term, because sometimes I know it's just not practical. If you ask a landowner some questions during that communication process and a landowner says, I'm planning on selling the farm in a couple years, that, might seem like a bad way to start. But in terms of, what the farmer's options are moving forward, but farmers do have some options there. And, you have some there. If you go and get some legal advice, a good land use attorney will be able to draft a right of first offer or a right of first refusal for the farm. I hear from disappointed farmers often when they had talked over the years with the landowner about wanting to buy the farm in the future, and then they're not actually offered that ability to buy the farm, to make that offer when it comes down to it. And they don't hear until the farm's already sold, and they can be very devastated and upset at that point, because they thought they told the landowner that was their intention. They thought the landowner also understood that intention. And so a right of first offer, a right of first refusal, it's just going to put that in writing. It's going to give the farmer that ability to, when that time comes, to be able to have a meaningful right to see if they could purchase the farm at that point. Defining stewardship. So how do we define what good farming is? There's many ways to do it. It's going to depend on the leasing parties and what you expect, but you can reference state or national farming standards. You can also define stewardship by incorporating a reference to the farm soil and water conservation plan. Sometimes folks want to get more specific, and that's fine. If that's what the landowner expects, then that's what should be in the lease. If this is an organic lease, it's obviously going to have those specifications in it. We've gotten questions the last couple of years when landowners call farmers sometimes mid-lease and express concern about the use of pesticides and herbicides. And that can create a lot of conflict, as you can imagine, and be really frustrating for farmers when, landowners are kind of making demands about input usage or applications. There's options to work through that. But if a landowner gives any of those indications, that's the kind of thing that should be in a lease. And there can be some simple solutions. Oftentimes, if a landowner lives on the farm or lives near the farm, it may be enough to put a notice provision in the lease. And that's an option on the Lease Builder website. Do you want 24 hours notice, or, whatever is practicable for you both, 8 hours notice before I apply certain pesticides, so that if if the landowner doesn't want their family there, if they don't want the dog out in the yard before the pesticides or herbicides are applied, then that notice is given. It might be enough to kind of ease that potential conflict area. So here's just some images from the Lease Builder. So we'll ask you if there's a conservation plan, and then if you click yes or no, you're given the option to attach it as an exhibit to the lease, and then both parties are on notice about it. And then you can see here we've also given you some options of ways that you could define farm stewardship, either by referencing those standards or more specifically referencing the plan itself. Restrictions in conservation. So this might not be an issue for everybody, but some farmers have intentions to do, things other than perhaps traditional farming on the property. What if they want to have a corn maze in the fall? What if they want to start a community supported agriculture component to their farm, right? And then they're going to have 50 people showing up on Tuesday afternoon to get their CSA box. If there are restrictions that are already on the farm, either through a conservation easement or zoning or other types of easements, that should be something that's communicated to the farmer. So make sure that, especially a conservation easement, because that's usually the most restrictive type of easement that we see, Sometimes farmers take the risk of planting in an easement area if it's, like an easement held by the power company or that type of thing. Sometimes the power company has easements over parts of farmland and they may not exercise the use of that area for 50 years. And then so farmers go ahead and plant. But conservation easements are going to be a lot more specific. And so if the farm has an easement, it's a good consideration to attach a copy of the easement to the lease and make compliance with that conservation easement another provision of the lease. And so that's another option on the site as well. So here you go. We've given you some options here, and this is all optional. The draft that gets sent to you when you use the lease building website is a Word document. So, you can go in and after consultation with your attorney, you can edit it as much as you'd like. But here's some, some thoughts about whether you'd want the tenant to have some restrictions or not. And then, the explanation of what I just said of why we would be worried about a conservation easement during the leasing process. Okay, so specific practices. So practices themselves, I think it's a good idea to reference them, especially depending on the type of practice that we're talking about. So when you go on the Lease Builder website, you'll see again, for the knowledge deficit we're trying to overcome, for each of these practices, we define them and we explain what they are. So something like cover crops, if you're new to ag, you might not know what they are or why that they would need to be implemented. And so if you check yes to cover crops, you're going to get some considerations to think about. So, if you're seeking state or federal funding, who's going to enroll in that program? Is the landowner going to be enrolling in that cost share program, or is the farmer going to be enrolling in that? Are there certain varieties that need to be planted? And again, a landowner might not care about something like varieties, but they might. So these are just things to think about whether you want to have this conversation or not. And then if there is state or federal funding, what happens if that funding doesn't cover the costs, right? We've got the costs of the seed, we got to put it in the ground, we have to kill it off at some point. Most people are doing that. And so, that all costs money. If you're aerially applying it, that's going to cost money. So who's going to be covering the shortfall if there's a shortfall? Even in a state like Maryland, where we have a very well-established cover crop program and a lot of folks participate in it, I still hear from farmers that landowners, especially folks that are new to agriculture, when they hear that the farmer is getting a check for something that's going on the farm, it can cause problems if they don't understand what it's for, if they don't understand the cover crop program. So, use the leasing process as an excuse to just have that conversation with the landowner. Here's what the program is. This is why I would get a check from the state. This is what it would cover. It usually covers expenses, or it usually runs a little short, and I'm going to be the one covering that shortfall. So the costs, when you're thinking about the costs that may pop up here, initial implementation, yield and profit losses, like I mentioned, maintenance, and then how can we address these things in a lease? Well, I know this isn't always the most popular option for landowners, but rent can be discounted. So you can gradually discount rent over time. If there's going to be an initial hit, you can, just have a little schedule in the lease whereby it's reduced a little bit over time. Program payments can be shared. And so on that Go Maryland Conservation Leasing site that I showed you before a couple slides ago, we've got a presentation there where we had a recorded webinar on that webpage where we specifically talked about this issue. We had NRCS folks there. We had folks from the state cost share program, and they talked about how farmers and landowners can go about sharing these program payments. And then, if money is not going to be the answer, maybe something like a longer lease term would have value to a farmer. So, it's an option that you might want to consider. Don't forget about the tax implications. I mentioned that we have a tax document on that leasing website. And the reason that we do is because farmers are usually pretty well aware and used to dealing with getting federal program payments and then understanding that there's going to be tax implications there. But we heard stories when we talked about this project throughout our region that, you know, sometimes landowners that was an unwelcome surprise for landowners. If the landowners were the ones that were applying for the conservation cost share and they weren't familiar with ag, they might not understand that that's going to be taxable. And so nobody likes a tax surprise. And so that's why we have some tax resources there. Okay, so to explain how you would go through addressing costs and then compensating for those costs, here's another conservation practice option for a riparian buffer. So again, the considerations would be, you know, is the farmer aware of the required width of the buffer? So in this instance, the landowner would be going in and applying for that. Buffer shrink over time. And we wouldn't want a farmer to be on the hook for that if, you know, if the buffer shrinks and then the landowner and the farmer are both pointing at each other in terms of who's responsible for that. You know, put the width of the buffer in the lease, stake it out, and make sure that you're both aware of how wide that buffer is supposed to be. And then what are the maintenance restrictions in that buffer? What can farmers do? What disease weed management challenges are you going to have for something like a vegetative buffer? If the buffer is enrolled in a program like CRP, is the funding going to be shared to compensate for those maintenance responsibilities? Okay, here's a little the image on the right here. You can see that this is giving you some options for that landlord entry issue I discussed earlier. So, you know, you can go through and pick as many of these as you like when you're asked about under what circumstances would you want the landowner to be able to come back onto the farm, to consult with the tenant, to make repairs and improvements. After notice termination, you know, you often have to give a lot of notice to terminate an ag lease. So there can be a significant time after that notice of termination, but before the farmer actually has to be off of the ground. So that's an issue that you might want to think about and address. If you've got to get, if the landowner has to give 6 months notice, they might want to be doing things on the farm within that 6-month period. But the farmer doesn't want to be disturbed, right? Because they're still paying to be on that ground. So this is just some suggestions for you to work through and pick, and then those will populate in the draft that gets emailed to you. All right, so I am a glass half empty person, and that makes me a decent legal thinker, because you have to think about the what ifs and kind of, you know, the worst case scenario when you're thinking about leasing. You want a lease that is out in front of those problems and prevents those issues before they start. So I say a good lease considers the what ifs. So what happens if a rent payment is late? How often are you going to be willing to accept late rent payments before you want to be able to terminate that lease? I had this issue a lot when I was in private practice with residential leases and other types of leases, but oftentimes landowners don't think about if the person is consistently late, you know, but they're paying the rent, is that a breach or is that not a breach? Landowners usually have, you know, a short temper about that and want to be done with the person and want to end the relationship. But if they're actually still paying the rent, it's going to be a difficult thing to terminate it. So do you want to have a penalty based on late rent? Do you want to give them a grace period? And then very important is what constitutes a breach of the lease. Do you want to have any violation of any of the lease terms be a breach, or do you want it to be more specific than that? And again, if someone breaches, do you want to be giving notice so that they have time to resolve the issue? So, you know, if it's an unintentional breach or if it's a breach that can be resolved, do you want to be able to have notice and, you know, give the person an opportunity to get back on track before that becomes a breach that would allow for termination? So basically, when I'm saying what constitutes a breach, you just want to know, you know, what's the deal breaker? What's the thing that would actually allow me to move towards termination of the lease? Do you want to mediate before you litigate? So some people absolutely abhor going to court. They do not want to go to court. That seems like a terrible thing for them, very stressful. and they don't want to have anything to do with court. Other people, they don't mind, right? And so this is really going to be a personal choice for the parties. If you're the type of person who does not want to go to court, that seems like a terrible situation for you, then you can put in the lease that you guys agree, the leasing parties agree to mediate before you litigate. Most states, Maryland being one of them, has a low-cost mediation program. It's a USDA certified program. It's specifically for farmers. It's a very good deal, really. And you get trained mediators who are used to working with parties. And so if you put that in the lease, that you both agree to mediate before you litigate, it can add a little bit more time onto the system if ultimately you end up having to go to court. But, if you really don't want to go to court, it gives you an opportunity to work things out before you get there. Another little thing that populates automatically in your lease draft that I think is a really important point, and one that folks often miss when they're drafting leases, is if you go to court and you win, who pays the attorney's fees? I hated when I used to go to court with clients and we would win, and they would say, "Oh, good, we won." And then I'd say, but my bill's still coming. So you got to factor that into, whether or not actually you financially won. Unless it was clear in the contract, or in this case in the lease, that the prevailing party got their attorney's fees paid by the non-prevailing party, then, it's very difficult sometimes to get judges to order that. So it doesn't have, you'll see the one that pops up in the draft. It's not complicated. It just basically says the winner, if you end up in court, the winner also gets their attorney's fees, which is, most of the time what winning parties are going to want to have happen. So if you go through the lease builder, it's going to send you a draft. It's really important that the draft is reviewed by qualified attorneys. It isn't supposed to be taking the place of meeting with an attorney. It's really just supposed to be getting you started in the process. Attorneys are going to make sure you understand the obligations in the lease. And, attorneys see leases all the time, various types of leases. And so we're usually pretty good at, thinking back on all the different situations we've had with clients and, making sure that the lease is going to protect you. So it's usually well worth your visit. Agree to meet annually between the landowner and the farmer. If you're close enough, walk the farm, talk about what's going on the farm. If you're not close enough to walk the farm together, set up a call or a Zoom, talk about what went on the farm, talk about the lease and whether or not it needs to be revised or whether it's still going to work for you for the coming year. So here's some of the resources that we have at the ALEI website, umaglaw.org. We have this great ag leasing in Maryland. We've got fillable PDF documents that will get you started as well. We've got a poultry house lease. We've got a grazing lease. We've got videos about leasing, you name it. We get a lot of questions about leasing. So we've got a lot of leasing resources. So check them out. And if like I said, if you have a question, you don't see what you need, please be in touch with us. I'm happy to try to help you through your process. I'm happy to also take questions now. And so I am going to stop sharing because that was a lot from me. Yeah, Shan, I'm looking at the chat now to see if we have any questions that I can address. Okay. Karen asked a question. Also, when someone passes away, the heir doesn't know what the handshake terms were. Yes, agreed 100%, Karen. That's a big problem. Losing the landowner or the farmer, it's really difficult and can cause conflict. I've had that same issue as well with a farmer who thought they were going to be able to buy the farm. That was always the handshake with the landowner. Landowner dies unexpectedly. The heirs don't feel like they want to sell it to the farmer. Maybe they don't know the farmer, and the estate just proceeds to sell the property. So that can be a disappointment. Anybody else have questions that I could answer? All right, well, oh, go ahead, Dana.
Oh, hi.
Hi.
I don't have actually any questions. I just wanted to say how super informative this was in working with NRCS. I'm noticing that this is kind of a bottleneck, and I love your website. I've been on it before, and the information I just find super helpful in advancing conservation. So I just wanted to say thank you, and I'll be visiting your site.
Oh, great. Thank you very much. I really appreciate hearing that. Okay, and I put my email and my number in the chat since my slides went away fairly quickly there. Is there any question in the chat? Is there any page where I can find land to buy? Yeah, I would look at the Somatic farm link page. So the Southern Maryland Agricultural Development Commission, I think that's the C. That's Somatic, and they've got farm listings on their website. They've taken up the Maryland Farm Link website. Gabrielle, did you have a question? Go ahead.
Hi, yes.
Hi.
So hypothetically, if I have land, well, I do have land, how will I go about getting like a lease to the government to allow my land to be used as like an urban farm or a garden, or is that like a possible thing to do?
You own the property
Yes,
and you want to create an urban farm.
yes, like an incubator farm.
Okay. Why? I guess I'm a little bit confused. Why would you need a lease if you own it?
No, how would I go about leasing that out?
Oh, I see.
Government, or like get a contract in the sense of, because I know in DC they do that, and I also in South Carolina, and I just wanted to know, like, is that something doable in Maryland? They do have multiple like incubator farms, like in Watkins, Maryland, and Upper Marlboro. So I was just wondering, like, how do you go about that, or is that like doable for me since it's my land and not a government-owned land?
Gotcha. Okay. What county are you in?
I'm in Prince George's County, but yeah, like Upper Marlboro, Bowie area.
Okay, good. I was hoping that was what you were going to say. Because Prince George's County is great about urban farming, and I am going to put in a name in an email of have you gone to the Prince George's County Soil Conservation District?
I have not.
Because they're one of the few counties in our state that has a specific urban agriculture person. Her name is Kim Rush Lynch, and she's wonderful. And she is at the Soil Conservation District. So I would talk to her, and I'm going to put her email in the chat now, because I think she would be able to help you. She knows most of the folks that are involved with urban farming in that county. So I think she'd be able to help you find the right person. And in terms of the actual lease, that is something that ALEI is working on actively. We are trying to come up with an urban ag lease. So
Okay, awesome.
keep your eye on our website. We started that, and it's a little tricky because there's so many different types of land ownership and land holding type arrangements with urban ag, but we're working on it. And I hope we have something this fall on that, a model urban ag lease. And Kim is aware of that too.
Okay, great. Yeah, because I'm very, very new to this. Like, I've inherited land here and then in South Carolina. So I just want to kind of weigh my options out and kind of get a feel of what I can do. And then what can I do for the community as well?
Yeah, and I mean, with urban farming, zoning is going to be an important part of that. You're going to have to start with your zoning designation and figure out what you're permitted to do there.
Okay.
And she should be able to help you with that as well. But if you run into any roadblocks, feel free to get back in touch, because I'm happy to help you out with that.
Awesome. Okay, one more question.
Yeah.
So there is a plot of land that I saw. It's like an empty lot, but it's in a residential neighborhood. How would I go about like purchasing that from maybe the owner, or leasing that from the owner to maybe start like a very small like community garden, and that area is in Capitol Heights.
Yeah, so that again, it's gonna begin with
With
zoning.
that okay.
Yeah, so I would, if it's in the municipality, you're gonna go to the municipality. If it's in the county, you're gonna go to the county office of planning and zoning. You're gonna say, this is the address, what's the zoning designation, and then, what am I permitted to do on this lot? Sometimes, urban ag is not gonna be or even a community garden. It might not be a permitted use if it's in a residential zone. So you're definitely gonna wanna try to do all that research before you enter into any kind of a lease.
Right. Okay, well, thank you. That was it.
You're welcome.
So much.
You're welcome. Thank you. Karen asked, is there anything in the lease builder addressing the farmer having liability insurance? Yes, there is, Karen.
Sarah,
So, yeah,
I'm so sorry to interrupt. Before you answer Karen's question,
sure.
would you mind posting the Southern Maryland land page that you mentioned earlier? Lucky was asking if you would post that in the chat.
Sure, I will. Yes, Karen, we have it. So when you play with it and it comes to, you get the draft, you should see some boilerplate about insurance. And yes, I agree. You will give you some insurance options there about who's insuring what on the farm, and if the farmer's holding the liability insurance, which is usually going to be the case, then they list the landowner as an insured. So we will give you some suggested language for that, because I know insurance is a really important issue. So that's a good question. All right, let me try to see if I can pull this up right now for the farm link. Okay. There's the Somatic website. Let me, oh, yep. So if you go under farmer resources on that site, all the way over, you see farmland and then Maryland Farm Link. And Maryland Farm Link is a way to connect landowners and farmers. If you strike out there, I would, you can always go talk to your local soil conservation district and or extension offices. And in a lot of places, those folks are all actually going to be in the same building. So a lot of locations have service centers is what they're called. And you're going to have the extension folks a couple doors down from the soil conservation folks. And, I would just, those are public servants. Those folks are there to help you. And so, talk to them about what you're looking for. They often have, they're often a wealth of information about a variety of topics, but they might be familiar with people, interested in finding tenants or vice versa. So, I would encourage you to utilize those folks. Are there any other questions?
We had one pop into the chat. What do you think is in high demand? Vegetable farms, animals, brewery, entertainment, solar farm?
Yes, I think those are all in high demand. So lucky if you have time to take the beginning farmer training course through University of Maryland Extension, I would encourage you to do that. If you don't, you can look through the beginning farmer guidebook. They have, there's some really good resources to help you sort through some of those decisions, which are crucial, right? It's everything. What kind of farm are you going to have? What are you going to grow? But the important thing is to try to come up with a business plan and work that through with an expert in extension, because there are farm business experts in extension, and they can help guide you through that. You don't want to get too far down a road with a specific type of farm and then figure out there's really not a viable market for that. You got to think about the market for those products really before you get going. I mean, it's all really going to depend on your geography too. right? I mean, we've got some really great farm breweries throughout our state here in Maryland, but you know, I think adjacency to urban areas and having a lot of folks that are looking to go spend money and hang out on a farm brewery is going to make all the difference there. So it's going to depend where you are. Solar, it's a very hot topic. You know, usually the solar developers are looking for people who have a pretty substantial amount of acreage. So they're looking at, you know, more than 5 acres. They're looking at bigger pieces of land, and they're going to want to lease that land from, they're trying to lease that land from farmers and install solar panels. And so there's not too much that you can do there once you've leased it out to a solar company, and they're going to want a long-term lease. So I'm sure Jim and Shannon can share with you those beginning farmer resources. They're really great. The guidebook is awesome. It's got chapters for all these issues that we've been talking about, chapters that explain how to look up your zoning and how to interpret your zoning, how to come up with that farm business plan. You know, all of these different topics are addressed, I think, very well in that guidebook. And we just revised it a year or two ago. And then, you know, and the training course is great too. Other questions? Okay, well, seeing none, thanks everybody for joining me today. I hope everybody has a great summer farming season, and you know, and please take advantage of all these resources and be in touch if you think there's anything else that the Agricultural Education Initiative can do for you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.